Janet Parker.
Here.
Councilman Aguirre.
Here.
Councilman Chapman. Councilwoman Jackson. Councilwoman Pepper. Councilman Safedine.
Here.
The next speaker is Adrian Sykes, followed by Gary Carr, followed by Janice Grenadier, followed by Michelle Reef. Ms. Sykes, good morning.
Good morning. My name is Adrian Fikes, Fikes. And I'm here to talk to you about the article that was recently published in the Washington Post where the Freedom House is for sale. And I know that this is a long-standing conversation that has been going on between the city as well as the Northern Virginia Urban League. I stand here before you as a resident of the city of Alexandria who is not in the room during these conversations but has definite concerns about how that property is being handled. So on the 14th of October, you all were here all day long listening to conversations about bike lanes. I took a tour sponsored by the Office of Historic Alexandria to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the restoring of the Freedman Cemetery. The first stop was the Freedom House, and we went down into the basement and we saw where the descendants of African Americans had been enchained, had been beaten, had been sold, had been terrorized. I am a descendant of African Americans who were enslaved in this country. The second stop was the seminary on Seminary Road, and we learned how that community cropped up on Seminary Hill and the African American community that lived and created a life in that neighborhood. The third stop was the Fort Ward Museum, where we learned about the thriving African American community that came here looking for protection during the Civil War from the Army, and then cropped up a wonderful, vibrant neighborhood that was then systematically dismantled by this government, by the Alexandria government, by the displacement and the marginalization of Black Americans. I've been here for over 20 years now. I raised my daughter here, and I never understood the tension in this city until I took that tour. I never understood the marginalization. You've made decisions about the African American community, and I'm not sure that you really understand what's happening with this Freedom House. So you will hear later today about the history behind that house, but I'm here to talk to you about how I would like you to take a proactive stance and do everything within your power to purchase the Freedom House, not just for the museum. We know that that's been marked as a historic property, but the square footage on top of that museum, you have a wonderful opportunity to create a place where you can begin engaging the community in the conversations you're having about racial equity in this city. Thank you.
Next speaker is Gary Carr, followed by Janice Grenadier, followed by Michelle Reef, followed by Jim McClellan, but I don't think he's with us this morning. So, all right, next speaker, Mr. Carr, my neighbor. Sir.
Yes. Pay it forward and pay it back. Mr. Mayor and members of council, my name is Gary Carr. I rise in support of the Freedom House and its museum located at 1315 Duke Street. I view this building as one of the most important structures in Alexandria, if not all of Virginia, indeed the United States. Why? It holds such importance because it represents more than its physical structure. It was once the site of several slave trading businesses. These types of enterprises represent the prime source of America's economic prosperity, fostered by the trafficking in human suffering. It could provide a significant window into the many problems of society today. More than that, it exposes a fact that is not well understood. Slavery was not one crime, but two. The first crime was the transatlantic slave trade, of which the whole world was indicted. The second crime was the domestic slave trade, of which the United States is uniquely complicit. It was that second crime, which threatened to rend the nation in two, that the Freedom House is one of the few representative surviving examples. In order to completely heal, we must understand that that building is a vehicle for greater learning. It must be accessible for generations. It must be expanded by institutions able to foster greater community dialogue. It must be open and available to the community. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm the immediate past president of the Guild, an auxiliary of the Northern Virginia Urban League, the owner of the building. As a result, I have a greater familiarity with the building than most. I've been alone in that building in the quiet of the night. I've been in the dungeon of a basement where it is so dark that when your eyes are open, it appears that they are closed. Visitors stop by and are humbled, sometimes moved to tears by being in a building that's the site of such pain. The city of Alexandria cannot, it should not be absolved in complicity in this violation. The condemned souls were marched through the city and down Duke Street in coffles to their woeful fate. But a larger story can also not be missed, which the Freedom House helps expose. These souls were forced, even kidnapped from their homes in the northeastern states and sold to untold suffering in the Deep South. These slaves could have been allowed to live free in the North, but like animals, they were sent to a fate next to hell. The Freedom House could provide much learning, so much understanding, and so much healing. It must be preserved. My favorite biblical verse is, many are called, but few are chosen. You were called to public service. You were chosen to address the fate of the Freedom House. I hope that you choose to do the right thing and pay it back and pay it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Green. Ms. Reif, good morning.
Good morning. When I was a child, I visited a historical site in Nebraska City known as John Brown's Cave. The small tunnel and cave underneath a 19th century cabin once harbored escaped slaves traveling to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Visiting that site made an impression on me, and I went on to earn a PhD in African American Studies from Temple University. I've since taught African American history at the City University of New York and Northern Virginia Community College. I'm here today to encourage the city to purchase the National Historic Landmark located at 1315 Duke Street, also known as the Freedom House Museum. Slavery in the United States can be understood in two phases. The first period was from the colonial era until 1808, when 500,000 Africans were trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. This transatlantic trade was abolished by an act of Congress in 1808, about the time that tobacco production was in decline and cotton production was increasing. The second period lasted from around 1808 until the outbreak of the Civil War. During this time, an estimated 1 million enslaved people were trafficked from states in the Upper South, primarily Virginia and Maryland, to the Mississippi Valley. Two white men, Isaac Franklin and his nephew, John Armfield, capitalized on the demand for labor in the Lower South. They based their human trafficking business out of 1315 Duke Street between 1828 and 1836, where they hired headhunters to scour the region, rounding up the enslaved. When a few hundred people were confined in the so-called slave pen, they were shackled together and marched either east down Duke Street to the Potomac River to be tightly packed on ships headed for New Orleans, or west on Little River Turnpike to spend the next 4 months walking to Natchez, Mississippi. Franklin and Armfield moved an estimated 10,000 enslaved people through this site, which means there are likely hundreds of thousands of living African American descendants today. According to a recent article in the Washington Post, they sold more enslaved people, separated more families, and made more money from the trade than almost anyone else in America, amassing a fortune worth several billions in today's dollars. When the company eventually closed, other human traffickers operated at the site until the Union Army confiscated the building during the Civil War. We live in a time when truth and facts are under assault. Freedom House has the power to preserve the truth of our past and bring it to life. Recent and ongoing research by historians is helping us better understand this important chapter in American history. I have letters from leading scholars on the domestic slave trade, and they all testify that Freedom House is a one-of-a-kind irreplaceable historic site. We have a responsibility to protect this history, not because it's a nice thing to do, but because if we don't, then other people may rewrite it for our children. This history belongs to all of us, and I believe this site should belong to all of us too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reef. Next speaker is Rick Murphy, followed by Tamsin Green. Mr. Murphy, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, Honorable Mayor, City Council members. My name is Rick Murphy. I wear an awful lot of hats. I am the National Vice President for History for the African American Historical Genealogical Society. I'm an author who's done an awful lot of research on African American history, and I'm also almost a 30-year resident of Alexandria, Virginia. I come to Rise to speak about Freedom House. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration of world people, where over 12 million men, women, and children were forcibly taken from Africa and transported to other continents over a 300-year period. Only 10 million Africans arrived at their port of call, in which only 360,000 Africans were brought to what was then called English North America. A few weeks ago, we commemorated the arrival of the first documented Africans in English North America, who arrived at Point Comfort just a few miles down the road in Hampton, Virginia. These were men, women, and children who many of us today are descended from, including myself, who descend from two of those very first Africans who arrived on August 25th, 1619. The accomplishments of these same first Africans were turned against their descendants and became the foundation for the 1705 slave codes, in which representatives from Alexandria helped to codify and benefit from. These very slave codes became the foundation of antebellum slavery and the foundation of the domestic slave trade, as previously discussed, a peculiar institution where over 1.5 million Americans of African descent were sold to the Deep South to feed a highly profitable cotton industry. And it was through these profits that helped to build the Alexandria seaport and serve as the economic foundation that the city benefits from today. The same seaport that those in the audience now look upon, and the same seaport that you as council members now sit underneath. The Franklin Armfield slave pen, the present-day Freedom House on Duke Street, was the very hellhole that many succumbed to before being sent south. The city of Alexandria and many of your predecessors profited mightily from this slave pen. Your predecessors not only profited from the sale of black men, women, and children, but to make sure that they were never forgotten, the root causes of the Civil War, they named our city's streets after the names of Confederate officers and built a Confederate monument in the heart of our city's commercial district. I sincerely hope that the city enters into a contract with the present-day owners of Freedom House and take every measure to do this. The cost may be high, the burden to preserve the building may be steep, but it must be done. And this should not be done because it's easy, it should be done because it's hard. But to atone to what happened to those men, women, and children, Alexandria needs to preserve the history of this building so that the lives, pain, and suffering of the enslaved will not be forgotten, and to take a proactive stand to ensure that the building needs to remain as a public site, and once done as part of the city's healing process, the building, museum, and artifacts should expand the entire building out of respect to the pain and suffering it and your predecessors once inflicted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. The final speaker of our public comment period. Let me just say, I know we had a number of speakers here today to speak in advocacy for the preservation of the Freedom House, and I think you saw probably a lot of nods from the council because I think you have a council that is committed to ensuring this property remains publicly accessible, ensure that we expand the interpretation of the history on that site. And I can say that this is an extremely active process on the part of the city government right now, engaging with a variety of public, private, and nonprofit partners to ensure that we reach that goal. I think we're not quite in the position to talk about all the details of that process as we speak, but just know that that there is a commitment on the part of the city government to ensuring that we reach that goal. This is something that I think the city recognizes is an extremely significant historic site in our community, and the last thing we want to do is see it fall into private hands or not become accessible to the public. So we are committed to making that happen. I know the city manager has been keeping the council well up to date on the process, and I trust he will continue to do so as we continue. I know that each of the members of council have been engaging with staff on that process and making sure that we reach that goal. So we appreciate you being here this morning and speaking out, and we will continue to plug away at this and make sure we achieve the goal that I think all of us share. Is there a motion to close the public comment period?
So moved.
It's a motion by Councilwoman Pepper, seconded by Councilman Chapman to close the public comment period. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. Madam Clerk.